So David shared with you the importance of creating a cohesive management team. And I'm going to talk to you about creating clarity. One of the things that I had to learn very early on in my career was it needs to happen in this order, though. I used to want to create that clarity, and you'll see why when we talk about the things that we're talking about creating clarity around. I wanted to do that first. But you really need to have that cohesive team in order to be able to do this. And you need to be sure folks are on the same page and they understand which team they're on and they're committed to that team. And so what I'm going to share with you are 6 critical components of clarity. So let's talk about those and what they are. So the first one is the answer to this question, why do we exist? This is really, if we go back to management science, all the management science that came out of the 80s and the early 90s with Drucker and Jack Welch and all those guys, and you had the mission, vision, and values. You remember that? Yeah? So when we talk about why does the organization exist, what we're talking about really is what is the mission of the organization. Now, how many of your organizations have a mission statement? How many of you know what it is? Sort of, kind of. I know Stuart does, because the organization that he was with, they do a real good job of everybody knows what this is and creating alignment. They're actually students of what we're talking about today across their organization, Intercontinental Hotel Group. And that's why this is so powerful. You've got to know, and it needs to not be something that sounds really good to just put on an annual report. It needs to be something that you can internalize. It needs to be something that drives decisions within the organization, and it needs to be something that helps you determine what we're not going to do or what we're going to say no to just as well as what we're going to say yes to and what we're about. Now here's one of the things that comes up over and over and over again as we survey CEOs at companies and we ask, what are the things that keep you up at night? What do you lose sleep over? One of the #1 answers is attracting and retaining top talent. Attracting and retaining top talent. And so as you look at this, 75% of the workforce by 2025 is going to be comprised of millennials. Now I see some grimaces. Yeah, it's a different breed. So you had the baby boomers, which were highly loyal to the company. You go get a job, you do everything, you leave it out there on the field every single day. You just kind of take it, and you're just a loyal soldier. Why? Well, they were trained by the World War II generation. And then you had Gen X, which was the next group, highly ambitious, a little bit more selfish. Okay, and then you've got these millennials who have been raised being told that they're special. This is the group where everybody got a trophy, right?
Yes.
Okay? They've got some different interest when it comes to what they're looking at for a career. This why is so important. If you look at the research, 85% are looking for work that makes a difference. It's not just good enough. What's the compensation plan? What are the benefits? They have an altruistic motive as they're looking for employment. And what's this other part down here? 71% out of that 85%, 71%, so almost all of them want a company that's focused on community and global social responsibility. Wow. Does this sound like the answer to the question, why does the organization exist, is pretty important if you want to attract these people? Absolutely. And do you need these people in your organization? Absolutely. You get a lot of fresh ideas. You get a tremendous amount of enthusiasm and energy out of this group. But you've got to be able to have an answer to the question why, and it can't just be cold, and it can't just be something that's, you know, in their welcome packet or on your marketing or sales collateral or the annual report. It has to mean something. It actually has to drive decisions in the organization. David talked a little bit about culture with organizations, and every organization, as he mentioned, has a culture. It's whether or not you're being intentional about it. At some point, and we kind of know when it was with Apple, it was when Jobs came back. When he came back, that's when there was a shift. But as David said, Steve Jobs didn't come up with those devices. It was the organization, but because now there was clarity around the why do we exist, they were able to reap the benefit of that innovation. And this is why this is so important. This is why these 4 disciplines are important and why we call this the secret of building a sustainable organization. Because if you've got this stuff down, and again, it's simple, but it's not easy, you are going to be able to survive. Think of those logos we had up at the beginning. How many of those companies have been around for a while? Most of them. How many have been through different seasons and cycles? Most of them. But they're able to innovate. IBM was a logo up there. What's the main business IBM's in today? Are they in the computer business?
No.
No. They don't make hardware. I mean, they've got some people that make hardware for them. That's a tiny little piece of their business.
That's right.
They're in services. They're probably closer to Deloitte than they are Dell. If you know what I mean. So this is why this is so important. Because it allows the organization to continually reinvent itself. This why is a huge thing. The second is, how do we behave? How do we behave? Now, most organizations have values. Let me see, how many, raise your hands. Does your organization have values? Are they written down somewhere? Most of you, right? How many of those values are directly tied to your performance review? Do we have anybody? We have 1 hand, 2 hands. When we're working with organizations at Cirrus, we like to tie these values to behaviors. You've got those values for a reason. What are the behaviors you're trying to create in the organization that reinforce the values that you've said are important to you? And do we have clarity around that? And this is why it's important to have a cohesive leadership team. And why you take that model and you push it down into the organization. So that you're not just creating trust at the management layer, you've got trust all the way out to the edges of the organization. Because without that trust, there's not going to be any accountability. And we're not just talking about accountability around financial results, we're talking about accountability around this too. Because your organization has an image, okay? You've got a brand that you're trying to create, both as an employer, as a customer to your vendors, and as a vendor to your customers. And do those behaviors reinforce the brand image? And is that a topic of discussion within your organization? Are you holding one another accountable to those behaviors? We've got a client we're working with right now, and they will hold one another accountable somewhat around performance metrics, but they avoid this topic altogether. They will not hold one another accountable for behaviors. And that's a sign that they've got a lack of what in the organization? Trust. Exactly. Exactly. So how do we behave? This is such an important question to be able to answer within the organization. The next question seems a little easier. It's what do we do? And this is where people try to go when they answer the why do we exist question. But it's what do we do? What business are we in? And this is extremely important. And I'll tell you a personal story. I moved out here to the Atlanta area as part of a turnaround team. That's where I spent most of my career doing turnarounds. I had an accounting and accounting information systems practice for a while. Ended up getting into telecom. Long story, I'll share it with you if you want it sometime, but ended up in telecom and then started doing these little turnarounds on these little regional telephone companies. And then ended up out here to be part of a leadership team to do a turnaround on a technology company right over here in Sewanee. Now, this company dealt with a lot of the application of 3D technology to solve problems. One of the problems we were trying to solve was education. How do we help people retain more, learn faster, all of those things. And so we were trying to apply 3D and engage the haptic envelope and all of this stuff, and it worked. We did a lot of work with the Army, and we applied that in a more manipulative way, to David's comment earlier, to marketing. How do you do that with marketing? We did some pretty cool stuff with Chiat Day and Visa Go World campaign around the Vancouver 2010 Games. My role was to run operations, and we were in a leadership meeting one day, and the CEO of that organization made a comment that I will never forget. We were talking about the answer to this question, because this company had been around for 5 years prior to when we had gotten there and had about $15 million poured into it with less than about $200,000 worth of cumulative revenue to show for it. We were brought in to see if there was any chance in saving that $15 million investment. And there was. They had some pretty cool IP and just general trade secrets and those kinds of things. And I remember an opportunity being talked about in that meeting. And one of the folks on the leadership team tried to stand up and hold the company accountable for what we had answered to this question. What did we do? And I remember the CEO saying, if somebody was willing to pay us $500,000 for ice cream cones, then folks, we're in the ice cream business. What? Does it surprise you? And the CEO, the way the organization was arranged, ran the sales part of the organization. We were able to insulate the operational aspect of the organization from stuff like that. But does it surprise you at all that there was a lack of clarity with the sales team? They kind of sort of knew what business we were in, but they could not have a coherent conversation with anybody about what we did or how we could solve their problem. They always had to drag somebody else in there, because they thought they were in whatever business they could get somebody to pay them to do. This is a very important question, because it's going to tell you, again, just like that, why do we exist? It's going to tell you what things you need to say no to. And that doesn't have to be no forever. It can just be no for now. Let's table that for a little bit. We'll take a look at that. Right now, we need to create some focus. Because if you're chasing things all around, odds are you've got a broken business model. You've got bigger problems than this can fix. Okay? We're talking about an assumption that you've got a solid business model. We just need to go out there and let's take this company to the top of its class in whatever niche you're in. And that's what we do here. So these offerings, the next question is, how will we succeed? What is it that we have to do to succeed? And this model may look familiar to some of you. This is Porter's arrow, and it talks about the value chain. What are the core competencies in the organization? And do they support the answer to how will we succeed? What makes us different? Because what you're trying to answer is the question, why should I buy from you? How long can a company have a sustainable advantage with intellectual property or a novel item? How long?
Not very long.
Not long at all, especially around software. It's crazy. So Apple came out with the iPhone. Prior to the iPhone, who dominated what you would even call the smartphone space? BlackBerry. Where are they today? They're hanging on by a fingernail, and that's about it, and that fingernail's cracking. Now, who's given Apple a run for the money in that business? Samsung. You don't have a sustainable advantage around a product or intellectual property. It can give you a leg up, it can help you get a first mover advantage, but it's not sustainable. This stuff is, and you've got to figure out the answer. Why do I need to buy from you? And if you're in a service business or if you're in a product business, unless you're inventing those products, odds are you may have a lock on the market for a little while with a particular vendor, but somebody's going to come in with another vendor that's got something just as good, if not better, and now you're going to be competing against them. And now the answer to this question can no longer be because we're the only place you can get this. It's an important question, and you need to make sure that the core competencies of the organization support the answer to how will we succeed. How will we succeed? The next question you've got to be able to answer to create clarity is what's most important right now. Because there are a lot of things we can do. We need to focus this down to what we can do, or what we should do. How many of you feel like this guy right here whenever you try to answer that question? Yeah. It's just, goodness gracious. And I do a lot of workshops with organizations on, we have a workshop called Managing Multiple Projects, Opportunities, and Deadlines. And it is an extremely popular workshop because most people feel just like this because they don't have a good answer to this question. Because the answer to this question becomes the last person that rang my phone, the last email that came in. It's just, we are in crisis management mode. Now, think back to what David said. What was bias number 2? Adrenaline bias. Now, if you are an S or a C, then actually probably just S's. The C's take great pleasure in being able to have their list and check stuff off their list. Okay? If things are happening too fast, the C's are going to get discombobulated. But if you are a D, it is real easy to feel like you are accomplishing things just because you're putting out fires all day. And as David said, you go home with your chest puffed out and you think, man, this was a productive day. And I encourage you to stop and ask yourself, what did I do today that focused on doing that? And if it's nothing, then we got to figure out how to manage that day better. How do we get out ahead of that? And when we worked with the military, if you think about a timeline, they had a phrase that I love this phrase. It's called acting to the left of the boom. We've got to react to the left of the boom so that we never even encounter the boom. Or when it happens, we're already ready for it. And that's what you've got to do. How many of you have read Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People? Okay, just about everybody in here. You remember this, the 4 quadrants. Most of us live our lives in these 2 quadrants, quadrants 1 and 3. I don't remember what he numbers them. We call them this quadrant 1, we call that 3, this is 2, and that's 4. The urgent and important. These are those customer calls, they're coming in. Now, are all customer calls urgent and important? Careful. We play roles in systems. Our customers play roles in systems. You teach people how to interact with you. Have you trained your customers that every time there's a crisis, you're the person to call? This is very dangerous as the leader of your organization. If you've got a team, You need to train your customer to be able to reach out to your team. If the only way they can get their answer is to come to you, then we've got some work to do with that team. We've got a knowledge gap, or maybe we just need to retrain the customer. There are certain customers that are just, it doesn't matter what you tell them, I need to speak to the CEO. I need to speak to the president. Right? But for the most part, we can train them. I had the same thing. I had a wholesale carrier, telephone company, for about 4.5 years. And we had some very large customers. A lot of our clients were cable companies, and we were the voice over IP phone service back behind a lot of the cable companies' offerings, back when they were just learning how to get into that business. And so I'd have this, the CEO of Cablevision, if he had a question, he wanted to be able to talk to me, or a VP, or whatever. And I had to teach them, look, I'm happy to help you, but you'll actually get your question answered faster if you'll call these guys. Because guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to go around, I'm going to have to ask them. If you'll call them, and if you're not getting your answer, please, by all means, call me. But if you'll go there first, you can probably get your answer a lot quicker than you can coming through me, because I have no idea. I don't even know where to start. So I've got to go figure that out in my own organization. But a lot of this comes back to training. And here's the other thing I'll say about this. Where is the stuff that's going to make the biggest difference in your organization? Which quadrant is it in? It's in quadrant 2. Now, this stuff right here is going to leap out at you. It will demand action. It will demand that you react to it. Will the stuff in quadrant 2 do that? No. So I'll give you a tip that we do in that time management workshop. Block out time on your calendar to work on quadrant 2 items. You have to be intentional about quadrant 2. It will not automatically get done. Now, will you think about quadrant 2? Probably. You'll probably think about quadrant 2 while you're driving home. Or you may stay up at night thinking about it, because all you've been doing is putting out fires all day, and you're sitting there going, man, I got to sit there and I got to create some clarity around the answers to these questions. I need to start thinking about my team and how we do some development of these folks. Do I have the right people on my team? Are we focused on the right thing? I need to do some more research around what our competition's doing out there. Are we starting to get past? These are all quadrant 2 things. Do we still have the right strategy? I haven't sat down with my CFO for a while. How are we doing on cash? What does our cash flow look like 4, 5, 6 months from now if we stay on the same course? It's all quadrant 2 stuff. Now, what happens if we ignore quadrant 2 long enough? It becomes quadrant 1, doesn't it? Yeah. So this is a very important question you need to be able to answer. And I want you to think about this in your own organization. Can you answer this question with a high degree of certainty right now? And if you can't, you need to seek clarity around that. Do you think that the people that report to you in your organization can answer this with clarity? If they can't, then you need to help create that clarity. That's what we're talking about here. This is another tool that we use when we're working with organizations. This is also in Lencioni's book. We had dashboards that we used. I like the way Lencioni puts this stuff together because it's highly portable. What do we mean by portable? David said it. It puts it in a package that's easy to understand. We've done this workshop with CEOs at multi-billion-dollar international companies. I've been on, I forget, 4 or 5 continents this last year, and we've done this with big groups, we've done this with small groups. I mean, people that work in warehouses, they get it. Doesn't matter if you barely got out of high school. They understand, they get this stuff. It's simple, and that's where the power is, because you can push this out to the edges of the organization. And what was the big word that started with A that David talked about? Alignment. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to create alignment within the organization. And this thematic goal, 6 to 9 month deadline, something we're going to be doing, this is what we're focused on, this is the most important thing. It gives people permission to say no for now. It helps them create clarity around how do we prioritize things. And we can go into more detail afterwards if you want to on this. But this is a very, very powerful tool. The last question that you've got to answer is who must do what? Who must do what? What are the individual responsibilities? And so often, how many of you have been in those meetings and you get to the end of the meeting and you've got all the action items and people have the action items listed and you go, that's great, and then everybody adjourns without assigning any kind of responsibility for the action items to anybody. There's just kind of an assumption. Okay, somebody's going to take those. So clarity around that. The larger the organization is, the easier it is to hide behind titles. It really is. And you think back to that picture of the boat that David shared with you. And that's what happens. But we've got to realize there's no, this department, there's no problem specific to this department. There's just organizational problems. And if we don't get it fixed, it'll either spread like a cancer or that hole alone could be big enough to sink the whole boat. So it's not about attacking that person. We'll make an assumption that we don't have a competence issue. If we've got a competence issue, that's a different thing. But assuming that you've got competent people in leadership roles within the organization, then you need to come together as a team and figure out, with the resources over which you've been given responsibility, how do I help this person fix that problem? And that's the kind of stuff that you see happening in an organization that's healthy. Because you've got a trust, you've got accountability, you've got folks working together. And now, I'm not worried about how that affects my budget. I'm looking at the bigger picture. And we're going to talk about, Judy's going to talk about how you communicate this, because that's another important piece. And then David and Judy and I are going to talk about how you reinforce this down in the organization. Because that last section is really where this starts getting pushed out to the edges, and how you make this stuff matter to your team. Okay? So, creating clarity. Why do we exist? Why do we exist? You've got to be able to answer that question. There's 2 stories that I'll share with you around this real quick. I had a client up in Boston. They are a hostel. You're familiar with that? The travelers, a lot of times international travelers or college kids like to stay at these hostels because they're fairly inexpensive and they're kind of communal, so there's a lot of social activities and things that go on there. And this was an international company that had several of these hostels that they had managed. Now, this particular hostel used to be a women's shelter, a woman's home. And when they bought it, they kind of transformed it into this new model. And the challenge, the reason I was asked to come out there and work with them, is they were struggling with customer service. The behaviors that they were getting around out of their customer service team were not reinforcing the brand image that they wanted. And this was the question we started with. Why is this hostel here? Why do you exist? Well, so there's a cheap place for people to stay. Okay, why is that important? How many of you are familiar with Lean and the 5 whys? Okay, a few of you. Okay, the 5 whys concept is anytime you get an answer, you ask why at least 5 times, or you just keep going until you run out of answers. So I said, why is that important? Well, I don't know. We've got a lot of international people and students, and they're traveling to America for their first time, and they need a cheap place to stay. Why is that important? Well, they're coming here because they want to see where America began, where this whole American experiment with American democracy started. Oh, well, that's interesting. So y'all are kind of like ambassadors, huh? Yeah, I guess we are. And it was amazing to see that staff as the light bulb went on and it kind of washed over the group. And the rest of the day was totally different. Because once we established that, then we went back to, okay, well, if you're an ambassador representing all this idealism that these foreigners have when they're coming to America, all these idealistic concepts about what it's like over here, what kind of behaviors do you think you need to be showing in the organization and modeling as a staff to reinforce that brand image? And it changed the whole conversation. And it changed how that organization thought about itself. The other story I'll share with you real quick, local company, little chicken outfit called Chick-fil-A. Y'all heard of them? Okay? Controversial because they stick to their values. Does anybody have, whether you work there or not, do you have any lack of clarity around what their values are? No. No. So a while back, you know that Chick-fil-A was one of those companies that nearly went away too, don't you? Think about Chick-fil-A in the 80s. They were struggling and they were almost gone. I have a good friend that is very close to the Cathys, and he's verified these stories. And one day, Truett's got his senior leadership team in the boardroom, and they're talking about all these different things that they need to do. And he goes, "We make chicken sandwiches. That's what we do. And we need everybody in this organization to be focused on the fact that we make chicken sandwiches. And we've got to get better before we can get bigger." And so a few weeks went by. Truett's leaving the corporate headquarters, and he passes the janitor that's cleaning the lobby. And I don't know what the guy's name was. We'll call him Joe, because I guess Joe's a good name for a janitor. And so he said, "Good evening, Mr. Cathy." He said, "Good evening, Joe." "Joe, what are you doing?" Joe thought for a second. He said, "I'm making chicken sandwiches, Mr. Cathy." And Mr. Cathy thought for a second. He goes, "Yes, you are, Joe. Keep up the good work." Do you think that was an organization that had clarity around the why do we exist? Have you ever been to a Chick-fil-A that's not busy? Do you think this clarity works? Yes, it does. How do we behave? That's the next one that's very important. What do we do? Focus. You can't be all things to all people. You don't have to be everything your competition is. You be unique. Be so good that they chase you. How will we succeed? What's most important right now? The how we succeed and what's most important right now. Do the core competencies of the organization reinforce that? It's very important. If they don't, then you either need to change your business or you need to get those core competencies within your organization. That's all Quadrant 2 stuff. It's all Quadrant 2 stuff. And it takes time to be in Quadrant 2, especially if you are a D or a C. You have to have that time. We stay in task mode. We've got to shift to creative mode. And if you're a D or a C, you know what I mean. You know it takes you a while to get in that creative problem-solving mode. Not crisis problem-solving mode. I'm talking things that are conceptual. So you need to make that time. And who must do what? Who must do what? Don't allow people to hide behind titles. Assign responsibility and keep folks accountable. I think we've got a few minutes for questions, and then we'll take a 10-minute break. Questions, thoughts, comments? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Can you talk about if you work as part of if you're not a CEO level, if you work as part of a larger organization that may or may not prescribe to this, how you can have influence in nudging organizations in this direction, or is it one no job?
It could be both. So I'm going to give you the typical consultant answer. It depends.
Yeah.
You can make a difference even if you're not at the top of the organizational chart? Does the leader have to always have the CEO title?
No.
In a lot of organizations, the leader actually does not. Now, you can start making a difference just wherever you are. And one of the areas that's easiest to do this, and it's most natural, is around the discussion on how do we behave in that whole brand image thing. Because within your department or area that you work, you could start the conversation over lunch one day. Just say, you know, what's the brand image we're trying to create as a team? And just throw it out. Everybody go, what do you mean? Well, how do we want other people in the organization to think about us? All right, well, do you think we behave that way now? And you just start that conversation. You say, what if we put together, you know, especially as we're hiring new people, as we're looking at people to bring into our department, what if we got a little more specific and we listed these behaviors out? And we start looking for people that are living these behaviors out in their life before they got here. How hard is it to change behavior? It's pretty hard. It's a lot easier to find somebody that's already got that bent and bring them in and get them up to speed on technical stuff, right? And you've heard it, you know, you hire for attitude, you hire for whatever, and you teach skills, right? So that's the way I do it. Now, here's the other side of it too. If you get so much resistance from that, from the organization that you're with, you may have to change organizations. Because this alignment thing not only works within the organization, but it works with you as an individual. So if your values and your why does not at some point intersect the organization with which you work, then there is some unfulfillment waiting to happen if it's not there already. And there's going to be a point where you're going to get to where it's just everything you can do to get out of that bed and drag yourself to just be in that organization one more day. A great friend of mine just left a huge governmental organization. They've done some great work, but a lot of the work that she was doing in that organization has passed now. And they're not doing a whole lot of that stuff anymore. And just the stuff that they were doing and what they had become, she was like, you know, she gave up pension, and I mean, you know, you can't get fired, you know, all of that, because it did not align with what she was about.
Chris, what do you recommend for creating, in a large organizations, creating that clarity all the way through the organization? I mean, it's easier on the leadership team when you meet every week, and how do you know it's getting out there, and what's the best way to push that out?
I am so glad you asked, because that's what Judy's going to talk about, and that's what we're all going to talk about in Discipline 4, because Discipline 3 and 4 are very highly related. So we are going to answer that. Any other questions before we take a 10-minute break?